Some stories were buried for a reason. Welcome to the Buried Stories. If dark history fascinates you, hit like and subscribe. Christmas morning crept in quietly at first, the way it always did on the plantation, with frost clinging to the edges of the cabins, and a pale grey light stretching slowly across the fields like a tired breath. The air was sharp enough to sting her lungs when she inhaled, but she barely noticed because her first instinct on waking was the same instinct that had guided her every morning since her child was born, her arms tightening around the small, warm body that slept curled against her chest. Only this time her hands closed around emptiness. For a few confused seconds she lay still, staring at the rough wooden wall, thinking perhaps the baby had shifted in the night or slipped down beside her, but the cold beside her did not move, did not breathe, did not make the tiny sound she knew as well as her own heartbeat. Panic rose slowly at first, like water seeping into cracks. Then all at once it flooded her, and she bolted upright, whispering her baby's name over and over, as if the sound alone could pull the child back from wherever it had gone. The cabin felt suddenly too large, too hollow, every shadow stretching and twisting into something threatening. She scrambled to her feet, her bare soul slapping against the frozen floor, and searched frantically, lifting the thin blanket, checking the corner where she sometimes laid the baby while working, her hands shaking so badly she could barely think. Outside she could hear laughter, distant but unmistakable, the high, careless sound of white voices greeting Christmas as if it were a gift meant only for them. The sound cut through her like a blade because it told her the world was moving forward without her, celebrating while her own had just ended. She pushed open the cabin door and stumbled into the yard, the cold biting into her skin, her breath coming out in white clouds that vanished as quickly as they formed. The sky was pale and hard, the kind of winter sky that looked beautiful to people who had the luxury of admiring it, and somewhere near the big house a bell rang, cheerful and cruel in its brightness. She saw movement near the main road, shapes gathering where no one ever gathered at that hour unless something was about to be taken away. Her heart began to pound so loudly she was sure others could hear it, a heavy, desperate rhythm that drowned out everything else. She started running, not caring that her dress was thin or that the ground was frozen, her legs moving on instinct alone, driven by a fear so deep it felt older than her own life. As she got closer, the scene sharpened into something her mind tried to reject. A wagon, hitched and waiting, the horses stamping impatiently, their breath rising in thick plumes, a man holding the reins with gloved hands as if this were nothing more than an ordinary errand. Near the wagon stood the master and mistress, dressed warmly, faces calm, already flushed with the comfort of the day. And there, wrapped tightly in cloth and laid among crates like an object with no name, was her baby. For a moment she could not move, could not speak, the sight so wrong that it made the world tilt. Then the sound tore out of her, a scream so raw it seemed to rip her open from the inside, her child's name breaking apart in her mouth as she ran forward, arms reaching, body lunging with everything she had left in her. Hands caught her, rough and unyielding, pulling her back as she fought and twisted, her nails scratching uselessly against thick coats. She begged then, words spilling out in a rush, promising obedience, promising anything, her voice cracking and breaking as she tried to make them see what they were doing. The master's face hardened, irritation flickering across it like a shadow passing over stone, and he told her to be quiet. Told her she was ruining the morning, told her that business did not stop for sentiment. The mistress turned her head away, pressing a lace handkerchief to her lips, as if the sight of a mother pleading for her child was something indecent. Someone laughed softly, a short, uncomfortable sound, and said it was Christmas, that she should be grateful, that the baby was healthy and would fetch a good price. Good price. The words echoed in her mind, hollow and unreal, as if spoken in a language she did not fully understand, though she understood their meaning all too well. She watched as the bundle was adjusted more securely, as if they feared it might fall, and the driver clucked his tongue, eager to be gone. She called out again, softer now, her voice hoarse, trying to soothe her child even as it was taken farther from her reach, trying to imprint her sound into the baby's memory so it would not forget her completely. The wagon lurched forward, wheels creaking, and she followed a step before the hands on her arms tightened, holding her in place as the distance grew with every turn of the wheels. The road stretched out long and white, and she watched until the wagon became smaller and smaller, until it was nothing more than a dark shape against the pale earth, and then it was gone entirely, swallowed by the horizon as if it had never existed. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound, pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. Around her, the plantation seemed to relax again, the moment of disruption passing quickly, people already turning back toward the warmth and light of the house. Someone muttered that chores still needed doing, that Christmas did not excuse laziness, and she felt herself being pushed gently but firmly toward her duties, her grief treated like an inconvenience that needed to be managed. She stood there for a long moment after let go of her, her body swaying slightly, the place where her child had been feeling impossibly empty, like a limb torn away without warning. The bell rang again, signaling breakfast, and the sound felt like mockery, bright and relentless. She looked at the big house, at the windows glowing with candlelight even in the morning, and something inside her shifted, settling into a cold, solid weight. Tears slid down her face, but they felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else, and beneath them a strange stillness spread, quieting the chaos in her mind. She understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that nothing she said or did in that moment could change what had happened. That Christmas morning had already taken its offering from her. As she turned slowly back toward the cabins, her steps unsteady but determined, she carried with her the image of the wagon disappearing down the road, the sound of the master's voice calling it business, and the knowledge that whatever she had been before this day was gone. The cold no longer bothered her, nor did the laughter drifting from the house, because something far more dangerous than pain had taken root inside her, something silent and patient, waiting for night to fall. The rest of the day unfolded around her as if nothing sacred had been violated, as if a mother had not just watched her child disappear down a frozen road, and that was what made every passing hour feel like a deliberate cruelty rather than the simple turning of time. She was sent back to work almost immediately, hands still trembling, eyes burning, her body moving because it had been trained to move no matter what was breaking inside. She carried trays into the big house where the air was thick with the smell of roasting meat and sweet spices, the warmth from the fire pressing against her skin in a way that felt wrong, undeserved, as though comfort. Tea itself were mocking her, laughter spilled across the polished floors, guests congratulating one another, speaking of blessings and gratitude, their voices rising and falling like music she could not escape. Every sound seemed too loud, every smile too wide, and she kept her eyes lowered because she knew if she looked at their faces too long, something might tear loose from her chest and expose the truth they were so eager to ignore. She poured drinks with steady hands that did not feel like her own, the liquid sloshing softly against the glass, and listened as someone joked about the fine weather for travel, about how lucky the buyer would be to get such a healthy little one. Their words, careless and light, tossed into the room without thought. Each sentence lodged itself inside her, not as pain, but as something heavier, something that sank and settled, layering itself quietly, patiently. The mistress moved through the room with practiced grace, directing servants, complimenting the decorations, her eyes sliding past her as though she were part of the furniture, useful but invisible. Once, their gazes met by accident, and for a brief flicker of a second, there was something like discomfort there, quickly masked by a tight smile and a turn of the head. That small moment did more to harden her than any shouted order could have, because it confirmed what she already knew, that her suffering was not a mistake, but an accepted cost of the day's happiness. As the morning wore on, her body obeyed commands automatically, muscle memory guiding her through tasks she had performed countless times before, while her mind drifted elsewhere, following the wagon down that road again and again, imagining the baby waking in a stranger's arms, crying for a voice that would not answer. She wondered if the child would remember her warmth, her smell, the rhythm of her breathing, or if that, Two would be taken and reshaped by new hands. The thought should have crushed her, but instead it sharpened her focus, narrowing her world until only a few clear truths remained. At midday, when the sun sat pale and weak behind clouds, she was sent to the kitchen, where the heat was stifling and the air buzzed with activity. Pots clanged, knives chopped, grease hissed, and the women working beside her avoided her eyes, not out of cruelty but fear, because grief like hers was contagious, a reminder of how fragile their own children were in a world that measured lives in coin. One of them brushed past her and murmured a quiet word of sorrow, so soft it was almost swallowed by the noise, and for a brief instant her chest tightened, the instinct to cling to that shared humanity flaring up before she smothered it. Sympathy would not bring her baby back, and it would not protect her from what had already been decided. As the hours dragged on, she noticed how the house prepared for night. Candles set out, curtains drawn, extra wood stacked near the fireplaces, all of it done with the same care and anticipation that marked every holiday. Christmas songs were hummed under breath, tunes she had heard since she was a child herself, melodies that once carried a fragile hope but now sounded hollow, stripped of meaning. She remembered singing softly to her baby in the dark, reshaping those same songs into something gentler, something meant only for the two of them, and the memory pressed against her ribs until breathing felt like work. The master passed through the kitchen at one point, his boots tracking in mud, his mood relaxed now that his business had been concluded. He spoke about the market, about how prices might rise in the coming months, about the satisfaction of a good deal made at the right time. When his gaze fell on her, there was no anger there, only mild annoyance. If her red eyes were an inconvenience rather than evidence of a wound he had inflicted. He told her to straighten herself, reminded her that guests were present, that the day was meant to be joyful. She lowered her head and answered as she had been taught, her voice calm, her expression carefully blank, and as she did something inside her locked into place, a door closing quietly but firmly. By afternoon the light began to fade, the sky darkening early as it did in winter, and with it came a strange sense of relief, because daylight had required her to witness the normalcy of their celebration, to see how easily her loss fit into the rhythm of their comfort. Night promised a different kind of cover, shadows long enough to hide in, silence deep enough to think. She finished her tasks methodically, noting details she had never paid attention to before, the way certain doors creaked, the places where drafts slipped in through the walls, the storage rooms where supplies were kept. It was not a conscious plan yet, not a clear intention, but her mind was arranging these observations carefully, storing them away with the same precision she had once used to remember her baby's feeding times. When the final meal was served and the guests settled into their chairs, content and drowsy from food and drink, she stood for a moment at the edge of the room, unseen, and watched them laugh, watched the firelight dance across their faces, turning them golden and unreal. They raised glasses to Christmas, to family, to prosperity, and the word family echoed in her head until it lost all meaning, reduced to a sound that belonged to them and not to her. She turned away before the bitterness could twist her expression, retreating back into the corridors where servants moved like quiet currents beneath the surface of the house's revelry. Outside, the cold had deepened, frost hardening the ground, and when she was finally dismissed to return to her cabin, the sky was already pricked with distant stars. She walked slowly, deliberately, each step measured, her breath steady, her mind eerily calm. The cabins were quiet, the other women inside tending to their own children, whispering stories, trying to hold on to the fragile peace of the night. She paused at her door, her hand resting on the rough wood, knowing that when she stepped inside the emptiness would rush to meet her again. For a moment she allowed herself to feel it fully, the ache, the absence, the unbearable knowledge that there would be no small body waiting for her, no soft sounds in the dark. Then she straightened, her jaw setting, and whatever tears remained dried before they could fall. Christmas Day had shown her exactly what her life was worth to them, exactly how easily joy was built on her suffering, and as darkness settled over the plantation, she understood that something irreversible had begun, something born not from sudden madness, but from a long, silent accounting that had finally reached its end. Night came down heavy and slow, wrapping the plantation in a darkness that felt thicker than usual, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The sounds changed first, laughter thinning out into murmurs, then into the soft closing of doors, the scrape of chairs, the last tired notes of a song drifting into silence. She lay on her narrow cot staring up at the low ceiling of her cabin, listening to the distant crackle of fires from the big house and the occasional burst of drunken laughter that slipped through the cold air, and she felt oddly separate from it all, as though she were already standing on the other side of something unseen. The emptiness beside her where her baby should have been pressed against her ribs, but instead of sobbing, she focused on the rhythm of her breathing. Slow and deliberate, the way she had learned to do when pain threatened to overwhelm her. Each inhale felt like gathering strength, each exhale like shedding something she no longer needed. She rose quietly, moving with care so the thin boards would not creak, and wrapped her shawl tightly around herself, the fabric carrying a faint memory of milk and warmth that made her pause for a heartbeat before she forced herself to keep going. Outside, the yard was still, the frost glittering faintly under the moonlight, the cabins dark, except for an occasional flicker of lamplight where another woman rocked a child to sleep. She did not look too closely, afraid of what that sight might awaken in her, and instead fixed her gaze on the path ahead, on the shapes she knew by heart, the outlines of buildings she had passed every day of her life. The shed behind the kitchen loomed like a shadow within a shadow, its door hanging slightly crooked, and she slipped inside, the smell hitting her immediately, sharp and unmistakable, oil and old wood and damp earth mingling in the cold air. Her hands moved without shaking now, finding the lantern, the rags, the containers stacked along the wall, each object familiar, each one suddenly heavy with meaning. She dipped a rag into the oil slowly, watching it darken as it soaked, the liquid clinging and spreading until the cloth felt dense and slick beneath her fingers. With every movement, memories rose unbidden, her baby's tiny fingers curling around hers, the way the child's chest fluttered with sleep, the soft weight of that small body against her own, and she let those images wash over her without fighting them, letting them settle into her muscles, into her bones. This was not a moment of blind rage, she realized, but something colder and clearer, something shaped by years of watching and waiting, of understanding exactly how the world were. Ked, and where its weakest points lay. She thought of the plantation as a living thing, its routines as predictable as breathing, its confidence built on the belief that it could never be touched by those it crushed beneath it. That belief was its greatest vulnerability. She tied the soaked rags carefully, bundling them so they could be carried easily, and tucked them beneath her shawl, the weight against her chest both comforting and terrible. When she stepped back outside, the cold air rushed in to meet her, and snow had begun to fall, light at first, delicate flakes drifting down as if unaware of what the night would bring. She almost laughed at the contrast, at how the world could look so clean and gentle while something so violent took shape within it. Her feet carried her toward the big house along paths she knew even in darkness, her body remembering where to step, where the ground dipped, where roots lay hidden beneath the frost. As she moved, she noticed details she had never cared about before, the way the wind funneled between buildings, the dry whisper of leaves caught beneath the porch, the stacked wood piled neatly near the wall, ready to feed flames meant for warmth and comfort. Each observation slid into place inside her mind, not as fear but as certainty. She circled the house slowly, keeping to the shadows, her breath steady, her ears alert for any sound of movement. The windows glowed faintly with candlelight, curtains drawn, the silhouettes of bodies moving lazily inside, unaware, unguarded. Somewhere within those walls, the master slept peacefully, satisfied with the day's transactions, and the mistress dreamed beneath fine sheets, perhaps telling herself that the morning's ugliness had been necessary, that it had nothing to do with her. The thought did not anger her, it clarified things. She moved toward the storage area first, where grain and supplies were kept dry and safe, where beams overhead were thick and old, their wood seasoned by years of sun and heat. She knelt and placed the first rag carefully, her fingers brushing against the cold ground, a smell of oil rising around her, sharp and undeniable. For a moment she hesitated, not out of doubt but out of awareness, fully conscious of the line she was about to cross, of the fact that once the flame caught, there would be no turning back, no pretending this was an accident or a momentary lapse. She thought again of the wagon rolling away, of the sound of her own voice breaking as she called out, and whatever remained of hesitation dissolved. She struck the spark and watched as it bloomed into a small, trembling flame, delicate as a living thing, and fed it gently, coaxing it until it caught, until it began to consume the cloth with a quiet, hungry sound. The heat brushed her face, and she felt it not as danger but as recognition, as if something inside her had finally found its match. She moved on quickly, placing more rags where she knew the fire would spread fastest, her steps measured, her mind focused, every sense sharpened. The snow thickened as she worked, flakes hissing softly as they touched the growing warmth, steam rising where cold met heat, the air filling with layered smells of oil, smoke, and wood. In the distance a dog barked once and then fell silent, and her heart skipped before settling again when no alarm followed. She was careful not to rush, knowing that haste led to mistakes, knowing that this had to be done right. When she finished placing the last rag, she stood back and took in the sight, the faint glow already creeping along the edges of the building, shadows flickering and stretching across the yard. She thought of all the nights she had stood outside this house waiting to be called in, of all the orders she had followed without question, of all the moments she had swallowed words to survive. Those memories did not hurt anymore. They simply existed, part of a life that was ending. She turned away then, moving toward the darkness beyond the yard, not running, not hiding, but walking with a calm purpose that felt almost peaceful. Behind her, the fire grew, finding new fuel, climbing eagerly, and as the first crack sounded from the strained wood, she knew that the plantation would never be the same again. That the night she had entered carrying only grief she was leaving, having set something irrevocable in motion. The fire spoke faster than anyone expected, its voice rising from a whisper into a roar that tore through the quiet of the night, and by the time the first shout rang out it was already too late for anyone to pretend this was a small thing. She had not gone far when the sound reached her, a sharp crack like bone snapping, followed by another and another as beams began to give way, and she stopped at the edge of the darkness to look back, not out of doubt, but out of a need to witness what had been set free. Flames climbed greedily along the side of the house, licking at the wood with a hunger that felt ancient, as if it had been waiting beneath the surface all along, and the glow spread outward, staining the snow a deep, unnatural orange. Windows burst with sudden pops, glass shattering and raining down like sharp, glittering tears, and smoke rolled upward in thick waves, blotting out the stars one by one. Bells clanged wildly now, no longer cheerful but frantic, their sound jagged and desperate as people poured from doors, half-dressed, faces pale and stunned, shouting names and orders that tangled uselessly in the air. She watched them run, watched the master stumble into the yard shouting commands that no one could hear over the crackle of fire and the screams of those scrambling to save what they could, and for the first time she saw fear carve deep lines into his face. Servants rushed forward with buckets, their movements chaotic, the water hissing uselessly against flames that had already found their strength, and she felt a strange detachment settle over her, as if she were observing a story she had heard long ago, finally being told out loud. The mistress appeared at an upstairs window, her silhouette stark against the blaze behind her, hair loose, nightclothes clutched tight around her body, and she screamed something that was lost to the roar, her voice thin and brittle compared to the sound of the house coming apart. Smoke poured into the rooms, curling like dark fingers through open doors, and people coughed and stumbled, dragged into the open by hands that did not stop to ask who they belonged to. The fire moved with a terrible intelligence, finding dry wood, stored grain, fabric and furniture, feeding on years of comfort and excess, turning them into fuel without distinction. The heat pressed outward, a living force, and even from where she stood she could feel it on her skin, a steady, undeniable presence that made her heart beat slower instead of faster. Someone shouted that the roof was going, and a moment later it collapsed inward with a thunderous crash that sent sparks shooting high into the sky, embers swirling like fireflies caught in a violent dance. The sound rolled across the fields, waking the cabins, pulling people from sleep, and she saw figures gather at a distance, enslaved men and women standing together in the cold, eyes reflecting the flames, their faces lit by fear, awe, and something she could not quite name. No one spoke, because there were no words for what they were seeing, because the house that had ruled their lives, that had loomed over every decision and punishment, was breaking apart in front of them. She-Fei. LT, their presence even without turning, felt the weight of their shared history hanging heavy in the air, and she wondered how many of them understood what this meant, how many sensed that this night would be remembered long after the ashes cooled. The master shouted again, ordering people to form lines to save what could be saved, but his voice cracked, swallowed by the collapse of another wall, and she saw him step back for the first time, retreating from the heat, his authority shriveling in the face of something he could not control. Horses screamed in their stalls, frantic and terrified, and someone rushed to free them, the animals bursting out into the yard, eyes wild, hooves slipping on frozen ground as they fled the glow. The snow continued to fall, thickening now, melting as it touched the fire, turning to steam that rose in ghostly clouds, as if the night itself were breathing in shock. She turned away then, not because she could not bear to watch, but because she had seen enough to know that what she had carried inside her was now fully outside, visible to everyone. She moved through the darkness beyond the reach of the firelight, her footsteps quiet, her body strangely light, as though the weight she had carried all day had finally been set down. Behind her the plantation raged, chaos unfolding in waves, people crying out, objects being dragged from rooms only to be dropped again when the heat became unbearable, and above it all the relentless sound of burning, a deep consuming roar that did not care for names or titles. As she walked, memories rose unbidden, not of pain this time but of small, ordinary moments she had once believed meaningless. Her baby's sleepy sighs, the way dawn light filtered through the cracks in her cabin, the feel of earth beneath her feet after rain, and she held those memories close, letting them anchor her as the night churned. Behind her, she did not run, even when voices shouted nearby, even when shadows moved at the edges of her vision, because there was nothing left to flee from in the way there had been that morning. The fire had drawn every eye, every fear, every urgency toward itself, and she slipped through the spaces it left behind, unseen and unremarked, just another shape swallowed by darkness. At the far edge of the field she paused and looked back one last time, the flames now towering, their light reaching far beyond the yard, painting the trees in harsh flickering colors, and she felt no triumph, no joy, only a profound stillness, a sense that something vast had been acknowledged at last. The house groaned again, a sound like an old animal in pain, and then another section gave way, collapsing in a shower of sparks, the cheers and cries of the onlookers mixing together in a wild, indistinct chorus. She turned her face away and continued on, the cold night closing around her, carrying with her the knowledge that the world she had known had burned with that house. And whatever came next, whatever name they gave this night, it would never be able to erase the truth of what had happened when a mother's grief met a system that believed itself untouchable. Dawn came slowly, as if the night itself was reluctant to release what it had witnessed, and when the first grey light finally spread across the land, it revealed a plantation transformed into a ruin that no one could deny. Smoke still drifted upward in lazy spirals, carrying the sharp scent of burned wood and melted iron, and ash lay scattered across the snow like a dark veil pulled over everything that had once seemed permanent. The big house was no longer a house at all, but a broken skeleton. Beams collapsed inward, walls blackened and split, chimneys standing alone like gravestones for a way of life that had insisted on its own. DWN eternity. People moved carefully around the wreckage, stepping over debris, coughing, whispering, their faces hollow with shock and exhaustion. The master stood among them, coat thrown hastily over his nightclothes, staring at what remained with an expression that shifted between fury and disbelief, as if the ground itself had betrayed him. The mistress sat wrapped in blankets near the edge of the yard, her hands trembling, eyes fixed on the ruins, as though she were trying to wake herself from a nightmare that refused to end. They spoke in low, urgent tones about loss, about rebuilding, about finding who was responsible, their words circling endlessly around money and damage and reputation, never once touching the deeper truth of what had burned with the house. In the cabins, people watched from doorways and windows, silent and still, holding their children close, the firelight from hours earlier still flickering in their memories. Some felt fear tightening their chests, knowing punishment would come, knowing that power rarely suffered a wound without striking back harder. Others felt something else, something dangerous and unfamiliar, a quiet stirring that they did not dare name aloud, because to name it would make it real. Stories began immediately, whispered from mouth to mouth, shaped and reshaped with each telling, some saying it had been an accident, others insisting it was the work of outsiders, still others lowering their voices to say it was a curse, a judgment for sins long ignored. No one spoke her name, not because they did not suspect, but because suspicion itself felt too heavy to carry openly. She was already gone by then, moving through the early light far from the smell of smoke, her feet numb from cold but steady, her breath even. She did not know where she would end up, only that each step away from the plantation loosened something inside her chest that had been locked tight for years. The road stretched ahead, pale and empty, bordered by fields that looked no different than they had the day before, indifferent to human suffering, and she walked it without hurry, without looking back again. Her thoughts drifted not toward fear of capture or punishment, but toward the baby, toward the fragile hope that somewhere, somehow, the child might one day hear a story about a fire on Christmas night and feel a strange, unexplainable pull in their chest, a sense that something had been done in their name. She imagined the child growing older, learning to speak, to walk, to survive in a world that would never offer gentleness freely, and she whispered words into the cold air, words of love and strength, meant to travel farther than she ever could. Behind her, the plantation would rebuild in time, perhaps smaller, perhaps wiser in its cruelty, but the night of fire would never fully fade, living on as a scar beneath the surface, a reminder that even the most rigid systems could be broken by what they dismissed as weakness. Those who had witnessed it would carry the image with them for the rest of their lives. The sound of beams collapsing, the sight of flames devouring wealth and certainty alike, and some would draw comfort from it in their darkest hours, while others would harden themselves against the fear it awakened. As the sun climbed higher, turning smoke into mist and ash into dull grey stains on the snow, the world resumed its careful pretense of order, but something essential had shifted, something no bell or prayer could undo. She kept walking until the ache in her legs became a steady companion, until hunger gnawed at her belly, until the day fully claimed her, and through it all she felt an unexpected calm, not happiness, not peace, but a sense of completion. As if a circle had finally closed. She had been stripped of everything that tied her to obedience, to hope placed in the hands of those who had never deserved it, and in that stripping she had found a terrible clarity. The fire had taken the plantation, but it had also taken her silence, her fear of consequence, her belief that endurance alone was a virtue. Long after the ashes were scattered by wind and time, long after new walls rose on old ground, the truth of that Christmas would remain, carried in whispers, in warnings, in the quiet understanding shared between those who knew that love, once violated beyond repair, could become a force capable of rewriting history in flame.